I've been hauling freight across this country for 30 years, and I've seen some strange things in my time. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw that night along the Missouri River. It was a crisp autumn evening, just past sunset, the kind where the air smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves. I was eastbound on I-90, my rig loaded down with electronics bound for Chicago. The drive had been uneventful so far, just me, my thermos of coffee, and Waylon Jennings keeping me company on the radio. As I approached the Missouri River crossing near Chamberlain, South Dakota, I noticed how the fading daylight painted the water a deep, rusty orange. It was prettier than any postcard, I'll tell you that. I was taking in the view when movement near the shoreline caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a deer come down for a drink. Lord knows I've seen plenty of those over the years. But as I drew closer to the bridge, I realized this was something much, much bigger. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I slowed the truck. There, not more than 50 yards from the highway, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, and it was covered in thick, dark hair from head to toe. Now, I'm not talking about some bear standing on its hind legs. This thing was shaped like a man, but broader, more powerful looking. It moved with a kind of grace you wouldn't expect from something so large. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as the creature bent down towards the river. Its movements were slow, deliberate. It cupped its hands, yes, hands, not paws, and brought the water to its mouth to drink. For a moment, just a brief moment, it turned its head and looked directly at me. I swear those eyes reflected the last light of day like twin coals burning in the twilight. They were intelligent eyes, aware. In that instant, I knew this was no animal. At least not any kind of animal we've got a name for. A shiver ran down my spine, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale, my hands slick with sweat on the wheel. The creature held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, as smooth as you please, it turned and loped off into the trees lining the riverbank. Its strides were long and powerful, eating up the ground faster than any human could run. In a blink it was gone, vanished into the gathering shadows like it had never been there at all. I sat there, my rig idling on the shoulder of the highway, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to pull back onto the road and put as many miles between me and that spot as I could. But another part, the part that's always been too curious for my own good, wouldn't let me leave just yet. With shaking hands, I put the truck in park and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing and the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. "You're losing it, old man," I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew what I'd seen was real as the steering wheel under my hands or the seat beneath me. I reached for the CB radio, my fingers fumbling with the mic. Who could I even tell about this? What would I say? "Breaker, breaker, this is Big John. Just saw Bigfoot taking a drink from the Missouri. Anyone copy?" "Yeah, right. That'd be a one-way ticket to becoming the laughingstock of every truck stop from here to the East Coast." I set the mic back down without keying it. No, this was something I'd have to keep to myself, at least for now. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I opened the door and climbed down from the cab. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way to the edge of the road. The air was cooler now, with a damp chill rising from the river. I stood there at the guardrail, peering into the gloom. The trees where the creature had disappeared were just dim shapes in the fading light. I strained my ears, listening for, well, I don't know what. Heavy footsteps, the crash of branches. But all I heard was the gentle lapping of the river and the occasional car passing behind me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something on the muddy bank below. Tracks. Big ones. I scrambled down the embankment, my boots slipping on the dew-damp grass. When I reached the water's edge, I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam illuminated a series of footprints leading from the water into the tree line. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and deeply pressed into the soft mud. I crouched down, my knees creaking in protest, and examined the prints more closely. They were clearly foot-shaped, with 5 distinct toes. But they were broader than a human foot, with a more pronounced arch. The stride length between them was massive, easily twice what mine would be. A twig snapped in the forest behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. Was it back? Was it watching me even now? "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the darkness. "Is anyone there?" Silence was my only answer. Well, silence and the sudden, frantic pounding of my own heart. I realized then just how vulnerable I was, standing alone in the dark on the edge of who knows what. Whatever I'd seen, whatever had made those tracks, it was still out there. And here I was, a out-of-shape, middle-aged trucker with nothing but a flashlight for protection. I scrambled back up to the road faster than I thought my old bones could move. Only when I was safely back in the cab of my truck, doors locked and engine running, did I start to feel like myself again. As I pulled back onto the highway, my mind was racing. What exactly had I seen? A bear? No, bears don't walk on two legs like that, and they sure as hell don't have hands. A man in a costume? Maybe, but who'd be out here in the middle of nowhere playing dress-up? No, deep down I knew what it had been, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the wild man of the woods. Whatever name you want to give it, I just had a close encounter with a bona fide cryptid. The next few hours of driving passed in a blur. I barely noticed the miles ticking by, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. Those eyes, that purposeful movement, the sheer size of the thing, it was burned into my memory like a brand. It wasn't until I pulled into a truck stop outside Sioux Falls that I realized how tightly I'd been gripping the wheel. My hands ached as I flexed them, trying to work out the stiffness. I climbed down from the cab on shaky legs and made my way into the brightly lit building. The normalcy of it all, the smell of greasy food, the chatter of other drivers, the tinny country music playing over the speakers, felt surreal after what I'd experienced. I slid onto a stool at the counter and ordered a coffee, black as midnight. As the waitress poured, I noticed my hands were still trembling slightly. "You all right there, honey?" she asked, concern etching her weathered face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I let out a weak chuckle. "Something like that," I muttered. She gave me a quizzical look but didn't press further. Probably used to seeing all sorts of odd behavior from road-weary truckers. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation from the booth behind me. Two younger drivers swapping stories about weird things they'd seen on the road. "I'm telling you, man," one was saying, "it was the biggest damn owl I've ever seen. Had to be at least 4 feet tall." His buddy laughed. "Yeah, right. And I saw the Loch Ness Monster in Lake Michigan last week." I turned slightly, watching them out of the corner of my eye. The first driver was getting frustrated, his voice rising. "I know what I saw. It was right there on the side of the road, big as life." All right, his friend said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "If you say you saw a giant owl, then you saw a giant owl. Who am I to argue?" I could see the defeat in the first driver's eyes. He knew what he'd seen, but he also knew how crazy it sounded. I recognized that look all too well. It was the same one I'd seen in my own reflection earlier. In that moment, I almost turned around, almost told them about what I'd seen by the river. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of ridicule, or maybe it was something else. A feeling that what I'd witnessed was something special, something not meant to be shared with just anyone. So I kept my mouth shut, finished my coffee, and headed back out to my rig. As I climbed into the cab, I took one last look at the starry sky above. The world suddenly felt a whole lot bigger, a whole lot stranger than it had just a few hours ago. I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, the long ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. But now, every shadow by the roadside held the possibility of mystery. Every dark patch of trees could be hiding something extraordinary. I don't know if I'll ever see another creature like the one I encountered that night. Part of me hopes I do, while another part hopes I don't. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at the world quite the same way again. And every time I cross that stretch of the Missouri River, I can't help but scan the shoreline, wondering if those coal-bright eyes are watching me from the shadows. I've driven through my fair share of fog in my 20 years on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Ozarks. It wasn't the thickness of the mist that got to me, though it was dense enough to make a man believe in ghosts. No, it was what I heard in that fog that still haunts me to this day. It was late October, just a few days shy of Halloween. I was hauling a load of auto parts from St. Louis to Little Rock, taking the scenic route through the Mark Twain National Forest. The leaves were a blaze of red and gold in the fading daylight, like nature's own fireworks show. As the sun dipped below the horizon, tendrils of mist began creeping out from between the trees. At first, it was just wisps here and there, nothing to worry about. But as I wound my way deeper into the forest, the fog thickened faster than a politician's lies at a town hall meeting. I flicked on my fog lights, but they did about as much good as a screen door on a submarine. The world outside my windshield had shrunk to a small bubble of murky white. I could barely see the yellow line on the edge of the road, let alone any wildlife that might decide to play chicken with my Peterbilt. I was considering pulling over to wait it out when I heard it. A long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. Now, I've heard wolves before. Hell, I've heard just about every critter that roams these parts. But this was something different. It was deeper, more guttural than any wolf I'd ever encountered. And there was something else in that sound, something almost human. I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Get a grip, Tom," I muttered to myself, "and it's just the fog playing tricks on you." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. That sound was as real as the steering wheel under my white-knuckled grip. I eased my foot off the gas, letting the rig slow to a crawl. Part of me wanted to floor it, to put as much distance between me and whatever had made that sound as possible. But in this fog, going any faster was a good way to end up wrapped around a tree. The howl came again, closer this time. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with a chorus of unearthly wails. They echoed off the hidden trees, making it impossible to tell which direction they were coming from. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I reached for the CB radio, desperate for some human contact. "Breaker, breaker. This is Lonesome Tom out on Route 19. Anybody copy?" Static was my only reply. I tried again, my voice cracking slightly. "Come on, somebody talk to me. I've got a situation out here." More static, then a burst of garbled sound that might have been a voice. I strained to make it out, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The howls were getting closer now, no doubt about it. They seemed to be coming from both sides of the road, like whatever was making them was pacing my truck. I clicked on my high beams, more out of desperation than any real hope they'd penetrate the fog. For a split second, I thought I saw something dart across the road ahead, a dark shape moving far too fast for its size, but it was gone before I could be sure, swallowed up by the mist. "Just your imagination," I told myself, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. The road curved sharply to the right, and I slowed even further to navigate the turn. As I did, something slammed into the side of my trailer with enough force to rock the entire rig. I let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush, fighting to keep the truck on the road. The howls had stopped, replaced by a sound that was somehow even worse, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from right outside my door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep hold of the wheel. I fumbled for the door lock, my eyes darting between the side mirror and the windshield. Not that it mattered. I couldn't see a damn thing in either direction. Another impact rocked the trailer, this time from the other side. It was like being caught between two battling giants with my truck as the prize. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was panic, maybe it was some deep-seated instinct for self-preservation. But I reached up and hit the air horn, letting out a long, ear-splitting blast. The effect was immediate. The growling stopped, replaced by high-pitched yelps of surprise or pain. I couldn't tell which. I heard the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush on both sides of the road, moving away from the truck. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I put the pedal to the metal, consequences be damned. The big diesel engine roared to life, and I shot forward into the fog like a bat out of hell. I don't know how long I drove like that, pushing the rig to its limits on a road I could barely see. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that endless white void. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the fog began to thin. The world outside my windshield slowly expanded, trees and road signs emerging like ghosts from the mist. When I finally broke free into a clear patch of road, the abrupt transition was almost shocking. I eased the truck onto the shoulder and set the brake, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and trying to slow my racing heart. When I finally worked up the courage to step out of the cab, my legs nearly buckled under me. I leaned against the side of the truck, gulping in deep breaths of the crisp night air. The forest was quiet now, eerily so. No howls, no growls, not even the usual nighttime chorus of insects and frogs. It was as if the entire woods was holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked around to the back of the trailer, dreading what I might find. In the harsh glare of my flashlight, I could see long scratches in the metal siding, deep gouges that no normal animal could have made. Whatever had hit me back there, it was big and strong, and definitely not something I ever wanted to meet face to face. As I stood there staring at the damage and trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, I heard it again. A single mournful howl, far off in the distance. It was answered by another, then another, fading away into the night. I scrambled back into the cab faster than I thought possible for a man my age, my heart pounding in my chest. I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the road, pushing the speed limit all the way to the nearest truck stop. It wasn't until I was parked under the bright lights of the lot, surrounded by other trucks and the comforting sounds of human activity, that I finally started to relax. I sat at the counter of the all-night diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to write it off as a hallucination, a trick of the fog in my tired mind. But I knew better. The scratches on my trailer were real enough, and the memory of those howls was etched into my brain like a bad tattoo. I overheard a couple of other drivers talking about strange sounds they'd heard in those woods. One of them mentioned an old Cherokee legend about spirit wolves that roamed the forests, protecting sacred land from intruders. I wanted to join their conversation, to share my own experience, but something held me back. How could I explain what had happened without sounding like I'd lost my mind? So I kept quiet, finished my coffee, and headed back out to my rig. As I climbed into the cab, I caught sight of my reflection in the side mirror. There was a new wariness in my eyes, a recognition that the world was a much stranger, much more dangerous place than I'd ever realized. I fired up the engine and pulled out onto the highway, the long ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. But now, every patch of fog held the possibility of terror. Every dark stretch of forest could be hiding something beyond my understanding. I don't know if I'll ever encounter those creatures again. Part of me hopes I do, if only to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But a bigger part hopes I don't, because I'm not sure I'd survive a second encounter. One thing's for certain, though. I'll never drive through the Ozarks on a foggy night again. Some roads are better left untraveled, some mysteries better left unsolved, and some howls in the night are better left unanswered. I've seen some strange things in my years on the road, but nothing comes close to that night at the Sleepy Hollow truck stop. It's the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. Even now, years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that thing burned into my mind. It was a chilly November night, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Philly to Chicago. My eyes were gritty with fatigue, and the white lines on the highway had started to dance in front of me. I knew I needed to stop before I became another statistic in a highway patrol report. The neon sign of the Sleepy Hollow truck stop beckoned like a lighthouse in a storm. It was one of those old-school places, family-owned, with home-cooked meals and showers that actually had decent water pressure. A little slice of heaven for us road warriors. I pulled my rig into the lot, which was about half full. Not bad for 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. As I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, I noticed how quiet it was. No idling engines, no murmur of conversation from the diner. Just an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. Shaking off the feeling, I headed for the diner. A bell jingled as I pushed open the door, but the sound seemed muffled, wrong somehow. The place was deserted, save for a lone waitress wiping down the counter. She looked up as I entered, and I swear I saw relief flash across her face. "Evening," I said, sliding onto a stool. Or I guess it's morning now. Could I get a coffee, black as my ex-wife's heart? The waitress, her name tag read Doris, managed a weak smile as she poured me a cup. Her hands were shaking slightly, I noticed. "You all right, Doris?" I asked, concern overriding my usual mind-your-own-business attitude. She glanced nervously at the windows before leaning in close. "Have you seen it?" she whispered. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Seen what?" Doris opened her mouth to reply, but her eyes suddenly went wide, focused on something over my shoulder. I turned, following her gaze, and that's when I saw it. There in the parking lot, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights, was the tallest, thinnest figure I've ever laid eyes on. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. Its limbs were impossibly long and spindly, like tree branches stripped of bark. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. Each step was slow, deliberate, almost graceful, like a spider creeping across its web. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there, now standing perfectly still between 2 parked semis. "What the hell is that?" I breathed, my coffee forgotten. Doris's voice was barely audible. "It showed up about an hour ago. Been stalking around the lot ever since. I've tried calling the cops, but the phones are dead, and nobody's come in or out since it appeared." As if hearing us, the figure's head swiveled in our direction. I couldn't make out any features. Its face, if you could call it that, seemed to be nothing but shadow. But I felt its gaze lock onto me, and in that moment, I knew true fear. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "My truck's right outside. We can—" I was cut off by a sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. It was like metal scraping against metal, but with an organic quality that made my skin crawl. The figure was moving again, gliding across the lot towards the diner. Doris let out a small whimper. I grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the back of the diner. "Is there another way out?" I hissed. She nodded, pointing to a door marked "Employees Only." We rushed through it, finding ourselves in a narrow hallway lined with boxes of supplies. At the end was a heavy metal door with a push bar. Just as we reached it, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its feeble light to find the door handle. As I pushed it open, I heard that awful scraping sound again, much closer this time. We burst out into the cool night air in a small alley behind the truck stop. My rig was just around the corner, and I made a beeline for it, practically dragging Doris with me. That's when I saw them. The other drivers. They were standing in a loose circle around my truck, their eyes fixed on the figure that now stood in the center of the lot. None of them were moving. None of them even seemed to be breathing. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to snap them out of whatever trance they were in. "We need to go! Now!" But they didn't react, didn't even twitch. It was like they were frozen in place, puppets with their strings cut. The figure's head turned towards us with that same agonizing slowness. I saw one of its arms begin to rise, elongating impossibly as it reached out towards the nearest driver. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I shoved my keys into Doris's hand. "Third truck from the left, big red Peterbilt. Get in and lock the doors. I'll be right behind you." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and took off running. I turned back to the lot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Hey, you!" I yelled at the figure, waving my arms. "Yeah, you overgrown pipe cleaner. Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" But it was quite possibly the dumbest thing I've ever done, but it worked. The figure's attention shifted from the catatonic drivers to me. It began to move in my direction, each step covering an impossible distance. I ran. Ran like I've never run before in my life. I could hear that scraping sound getting closer, feel the air grow colder around me. I reached my truck just as Doris was struggling to climb up into the cab. "Move!" I shouted, practically throwing her inside before scrambling in after her. I slammed the door shut and hit the lock just as something heavy thudded against the side of the truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I threw it into gear, not even bothering to buckle up. As I pulled out of the lot, I caught a glimpse of the figure in my side mirror. It was just standing there, watching us go. The other drivers were still frozen in place like some twisted tableau. I drove through the rest of the night and well into the next day, not daring to stop until we were 3 states away. Doris didn't say a word the whole time, just stared out the window with wide, shell-shocked eyes. When we finally did stop at a busy truck stop in broad daylight, Doris turned to me. What was that thing?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I shook my head. "I don't know, and I don't think I want to know. We reported what happened to the state police, but of course they didn't believe us. Said there was no record of any disturbance at the Sleepy Hollow truck stop that night. When I insisted, they started asking if I'd been drinking or taking any uppers to stay awake on the road. In the end, we gave up trying to convince them. Doris decided to stay with her sister in Iowa, wanting to put as much distance between herself and that place as possible. I can't say I blame her. As for me, I'm still driving, but I'm a lot more careful about where I stop these days. And I never ever drive after dark if I can help it. Sometimes when I'm on a lonely stretch of highway late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something tall and thin in my rearview mirror. It's gone when I look again, of course. Probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least that's what I tell myself. Because the alternative, well, let's just say there are some things in this world that are better left alone. Some mysteries that should remain unsolved. But I'll tell you this. If you're ever driving through the night and you see a sign for the Sleepy Hollow truck stop, just keep on going. No matter how tired you are, no matter how much you need a break. Because you never know what might be waiting for you in the parking lot at midnight. And trust me, some things are worse than driving tired. Much, much worse. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Tornadoes in Kansas, dust storms in Arizona, even a grizzly bear in Montana. But nothing in all my years on the road could have prepared me for what I encountered that moonlit night in northern Michigan. It's a story I've never told anyone, partly because I'm not sure anyone would believe me, and partly because I'm not sure I believe it myself. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Marquette, taking the scenic route up US 23 along the coast of Lake Huron. The fall colors were in full swing, painting the landscape in a riot of reds, oranges, and golds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The first sign that this wasn't going to be a normal night came when my radio started acting up. One minute I was listening to some classic rock, the next it was nothing but static. I fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same, just white noise and the occasional burst of what sounded like howling. "Damn thing's on the fritz again," I muttered, switching it off. The silence that followed was almost oppressive, broken only by the steady hum of my rig's engine. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights swept across something that made my blood run cold. There on the shoulder was what looked like a wolf. But this was no ordinary wolf. It was standing on its hind legs, easily 7 feet tall, its front paws, no hands resting on a gnarled walking stick. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I looked again, it was gone. Just the empty roadside, dark trees looming beyond. "Get it together, Mike," I told myself, shaking my head. "You're letting the long hours get to you." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Those yellow eyes glowing in the light of my high beams. The way it had stood there, almost human-like, watching me pass. I pushed the accelerator a little harder, eager to reach the next town. The sooner I could pull over and get some sleep, the better. The miles ticked by, but that uneasy feeling just kept growing. The forest seemed to press in closer to the road, the trees reaching out with gnarled branches like grasping fingers. More than once I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. It was nearing midnight when I saw the sign for a rest area coming up. Normally, I prefer to push through to actual towns, but at this point, any place to stop seemed like a godsend. I signaled and began to slow down. As I pulled into the rest area, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No other vehicles, no lights on in the little information building. Just my rig and the vast, dark forest surrounding us. I set the brake and killed the engine, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. That's when I heard it, a long, mournful howl echoing through the trees. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with a chorus of wolfish voices. Now, I've heard wolves before, but these howls were different. There was something almost human about them, an intelligence in the sound that sent shivers down my spine. I reached for the door handle, intending to make a quick dash to the restroom when movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the tree line, I saw them. A pack of wolves, but like no wolves I'd ever seen before. They were massive, easily the size of bears, with shaggy gray and black fur. But it was the way they moved that really got to me. They weren't loping on all fours like normal wolves. No, these creatures were walking upright, on 2 legs like men. My hand froze on the door handle, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. One of the wolf things turned its head in my direction, its eyes glowing an eerie yellow in the moonlight. It let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire truck. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I found myself reaching for my phone. With shaking hands, I managed to snap a picture through the windshield. The flash lit up the parking area for a split second, and in that moment, I saw them clearly. They were horrifying and fascinating all at once, powerfully built with hands that ended in wicked claws. Their faces were a disturbing mix of human and wolf features, with long snouts full of sharp teeth and eerily intelligent eyes. The flash seemed to startle them. They let out a series of barks and growls, clearly agitated. The largest one, a huge black creature that had to be 9 feet tall, stepped forward. It raised its head and let out a howl that shook me to my very core. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run even colder. Hanging from leather thongs around their necks were what looked like human skulls, bleached white by the sun and moon. In that moment, I knew I had to get out of there. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear. As I pulled out of the rest area, tires squealing, I saw the wolf creatures loping alongside in my side mirrors. They were incredibly fast, easily keeping pace with my rig as I accelerated down the highway. I pushed the speedometer well past the legal limit, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The wolf things showed no signs of tiring, running alongside like some nightmarish escort. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they began to fall behind. The last I saw of them in my mirrors was the big black one standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I didn't slow down until the sun started to peek over the horizon. By then, I was running on fumes, both the truck and myself. I pulled into the first truck stop I saw, my hands shaking as I set the brake. As I sat there trying to process what had happened, I remembered the picture I'd taken. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and opened the camera roll. The photo was there, but it wasn't what I expected. Instead of the pack of wolf creatures, all I saw was a blurry shot of trees and shadows. No glowing eyes, no upright wolves. Nothing to prove what I'd seen was real. Part of me was relieved. It meant I could write the whole thing off as a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, knew the truth. What I'd seen was real, even if I had no proof. I never reported what happened that night. Who would believe me? A story about werewolves in northern Michigan? I'd be laughed out of every truck stop from here to California. But I'll tell you this, I don't drive that stretch of US 23 at night anymore. And whenever I hear wolves howling in the distance, a part of me wonders if it's really wolves I'm hearing, or something else. Something that walks on 2 legs and wears the bones of its victims. I've been thinking about retiring, maybe settling down somewhere warm and sunny, far from dark forests and lonely highways. But a part of me knows that no matter how far I go, the memory of that night will always be with me. Sometimes late at night when I'm driving through some remote stretch of country, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my mirrors. A flash of yellow eyes, the hint of a lupine shape loping along in the darkness beyond my taillights. It's gone when I look again, of course. Probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least that's what I tell myself. Because the alternative, well, let's just say there are some things in this world that are better left alone. Some mysteries that should remain unsolved. But I'll tell you this. If you're ever driving through northern Michigan on a moonlit night and you see a rest area coming up, just keep on driving. No matter how tired you are, no matter how much you need a break. Because you never know what might be waiting for you in the shadows. And trust me, some things are worse than driving tired. Much, much worse. They say the forest has a voice, but I never believed it until that night. What I heard in those woods off Route 17 wasn't just the voice of nature. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in this world or any other. I've been hauling lumber out of the Pacific Northwest for going on 15 years now. I know these roads like the back of my hand, every twist and turn, every pothole and patch of bad asphalt. But that night it felt like I was driving through alien territory. It was late September and the first hints of fall were in the air. The days were getting shorter, the nights longer and colder. I was on my way back from a drop-off in Portland, my trailer empty and rattling behind me as I wound my way through the dense forests of western Oregon. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with the darkness and the glow of my headlights. The radio was on the fritz again, nothing but static and the occasional burst of garbled voices. I'd given up on it miles back, resigning myself to the monotonous hum of tires on asphalt. That's when I first heard it. A sound so faint I thought I was imagining things at first. It was low and rumbling, almost below the range of human hearing. More a vibration than a true sound, really. I felt it in my bones before I heard it in my ears. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Just tired, I muttered to myself, reaching for my thermos of coffee. But even as the bitter liquid hit my tongue, I knew this was something more than fatigue playing tricks on me. The sound was getting louder now, more distinct. It was coming from the forest on both sides of the road, seeming to move along with my truck. There was a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. But if that was breathing, whatever was doing it had to be massive, bigger than anything I knew lived in these woods. I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to put some distance between me and whatever was making that sound. But it kept pace effortlessly, growing louder with each passing mile. Now I could make out other noises layered within that deep, pulsing rhythm. High-pitched whistles that set my teeth on edge, clicking sounds like mandibles or beaks snapping together. And underneath it all, a low, mournful tone that made my heart ache with a sadness I couldn't explain. I was doing 80 in a 55 zone, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, when I saw the signs for a rundown gas station up ahead. Any other night I would have passed it by. These places always overcharge and the coffee tastes like motor oil, but right then it looked like salvation. I pulled in so fast I nearly jackknifed the trailer, the brakes squealing in protest. As I killed the engine, blessed silence descended. No unearthly sounds, no vibrations in my bones, just the ping of my cooling engine and the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. I practically fell out of the cab, my legs shaky beneath me. The night air was cool on my sweat-soaked skin as I made my way to the small convenience store attached to the station. A bored-looking teenager glanced up from his phone as I entered, then went back to whatever game he was playing. I grabbed a coffee and a handful of energy bars, more for something to do with my hands than out of any real hunger. "Anything weird happen around here lately?" I asked as I approached the counter, trying to keep my voice casual. The kid shrugged without looking up. "Define weird." I hesitated, not sure how to describe what I'd heard without sounding like I'd lost my mind. "I don't know. Strange noises in the woods, maybe? Animals acting funny?" That got his attention. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You hear something out there?" I nodded, relief washing over me. Yeah, like nothing I've ever heard before. Almost like the forest itself was, I don't know, talking or something. The kid's face went pale. He glanced nervously at the windows, then leaned in close. "Listen, man," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandpa used to tell stories about these woods. Said there were things living in them that ain't natural. Things that have been here since before people, maybe before time itself." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of things?" He shook his head. Grandpa never said exactly, just that they were old and hungry, and that sometimes, when the stars are right, they wake up and go hunting. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "And the sounds? The forest talking? That's them calling to each other, signaling that the hunt is on." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "Look, my shift ends in 10 minutes. If I were you, I'd wait it out here till morning. Ain't safe to be on those roads right now." Part of me wanted to laugh it off, tell the kid he'd been watching too many horror movies. But a bigger part, the part that had heard those impossible sounds, knew he was telling the truth. I nodded, grabbing my coffee and settling into one of the plastic chairs by the window. The kid went back to his phone, but I could see him glancing nervously at the darkness beyond the glass. As the hours ticked by, more truckers pulled in. Each had a similar story, strange sounds, a feeling of being watched, an overwhelming urge to get off the road. By the time dawn broke, the small parking lot was packed with rigs. We swapped stories as the sky lightened, each tale more unsettling than the last. One guy swore he'd seen something moving through the trees, something so big it made the pines look like saplings. Another said he'd heard voices calling his name from the darkness, trying to lure him off the road. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the gloom, an almost audible sigh of relief went through the group. Whatever had been out there in the night seemed to have retreated with the coming of day. I climbed back into my rig, exhausted but grateful to have made it through the night. As I pulled back onto Route 17, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brushed up against something ancient and terrible. Something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. I've driven that stretch of road many times since that night, always in daylight, always with a wary eye on the tree line. I've never heard those sounds again, never felt that bone-deep vibration. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the shadows are deep, I catch a hint of something. A whisper just on the edge of hearing, a movement glimpsed from the corner of my eye. And I remember the words of that gas station kid, about things that have been here since before time. Things that sleep and sometimes wake and hunt. I don't know if I believe in monsters, not really. But I believe in what I heard that night. And I believe that there are places in this world where the boundary between what we know and what we fear is thinner than we'd like to admit. So if you're ever driving through the forests of Western Oregon and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, something that makes your skin crawl and your heart race, don't stop, don't slow down, just keep driving and pray for daylight. Because in those woods, in the deep dark of night, there are things that hunger, things that call out in voices not meant for human ears. And if you listen too closely, if you let that call draw you in, you might just become another story told in whispers at truck stops and gas stations along Route 17. A cautionary tale for those who think they know all there is to know about the world. A reminder that sometimes the things we dismiss as legend or superstition have more truth to them than we'd care to admit. As for me, I still drive these roads. It's my job, after all. But I don't drive at night anymore, not if I can help it. And I always keep one eye on the woods. Because once you've heard the voice of the forest, really heard it, you never forget. And you never stop wondering when you might hear it again. I've outrun tornadoes in Kansas, dodged falling rocks in the Rockies, and even had a close call with a moose in Maine. But nothing in my 20 years of long-haul trucking could have prepared me for that night in the Cascade Mountains. It's a story that still makes my palms sweat and my heart race, even years later. It was late November, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Boise. The weather report had warned of an early winter storm rolling in, but I figured I could beat it if I pushed through the night. Big mistake. The first flakes started falling just as I hit the mountain pass. Within minutes, it was a full-on blizzard. The world outside my windshield had turned into a swirling white void, broken only by the occasional flash of my headlights reflecting off the snowflakes. I was white-knuckling the steering wheel, leaning forward as if those extra few inches would help me see better, when I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light and the swirling snow. But then I saw it again, a massive dark shape moving through the storm behind me. My first thought was that it must be another truck. But as I watched, I realized this was no 18-wheeler. It was moving too fast, too smoothly through the deepening snow. And it was big. Bigger than any vehicle I'd ever seen on these roads. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I looked again, it was gone. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The storm, the late hour, the stress of the drive, they were all messing with my head. But then I heard it. A howl that cut through the howling wind and the rumble of my engine. It was deep and primal, sending shivers down my spine. This was no coyote or stray dog. Whatever had made that sound was big, and it was close. I pushed down on the accelerator, my rig protesting as I urged it to go faster on the snow-slick road. In my mirrors, I caught another glimpse of the shape. It was closer now, and I could make out more details. It was lupine in form, but the size of a small elephant. Its fur was a mottled gray that seemed to shift and blend with the swirling snow. "This isn't happening," I muttered to myself, gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles turned white. "This can't be real." But with each passing moment, the creature drew closer. I could see its eyes now, glowing an eerie yellow in the gloom. They were fixed on my truck with an intelligence that was anything but animal. I fumbled for my CB radio, desperate to make contact with anyone who might be out on this godforsaken stretch of road. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Red, eastbound on I-90. I've got a situation here. Anyone copy it?" Static was my only reply. I was on my own. The wolf thing was practically on top of me now. In my mirror, I could see its massive jaws filled with teeth the size of hunting knives. It let out another howl, this one close enough to rattle my windows. I was doing 80 in a 55 zone on a mountain road in the middle of a blizzard. Part of me knew this was suicide, that I was more likely to drive off a cliff than outrun this impossible creature. But a bigger part, the part driven by pure animal panic, couldn't do anything but push the gas pedal closer to the floor. The next few minutes were a blur of white-knuckled turns and heart-stopping skids. The wolf thing kept pace effortlessly, sometimes disappearing into the swirling snow only to reappear even closer than before. I was just starting to think I might have a chance of outrunning it when disaster struck. As I came around a sharp bend, my trailer began to slide. I fought the wheel, trying to straighten out, but it was no use. The world spun around me as the truck jackknifed, sliding sideways down the road. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the guardrail approaching, saw the yawning chasm beyond it. In that moment, I was sure it was all over. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, the truck slammed to a halt. The trailer had wedged itself against the mountainside, stopping us just short of the precipice. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands still clenched on the wheel, heart pounding in my chest. The engine had stalled in the crash, and in the sudden silence, I could hear the wind howling outside. Slowly, I turned to look in my mirror, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing there. No monstrous wolf, no glowing eyes. Just swirling snow and darkness. With shaking hands, I reached for the door handle. I knew I needed to check the damage to call for help. But as I pushed the door open, letting in a blast of frigid air, I heard it again. That deep primordial howl echoing off the mountains. I froze, one foot on the step, straining my eyes to see through the storm. And then I saw it, not on the road behind me, but on the slope above. The wolf thing stood there, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It was even bigger than I'd thought, its shoulder easily level with the top of my cab. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I was terrified, sure that at any second it would leap down and finish what the crash had started. But it didn't move. It just watched me with those intelligent yellow eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned and loped off into the storm. Within seconds, it had vanished, swallowed up by the swirling snow. I don't know how long I stood there, half in and half out of my truck, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. It wasn't until I started shivering violently that I snapped out of it, scrambling back into the cab and slamming the door. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to key the mic on my radio. This time, miraculously, I got a response. A highway patrol officer was nearby and would be there in 20 minutes. Those were the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every creak of metal, every gust of wind had me jumping, sure the wolf thing was coming back. But it never did. When the patrol car finally pulled up, lights flashing, I almost cried with relief. The officer was kind but skeptical as I tried to explain what had happened. In the end, I left out the part about the giant wolf. No need to give him reason to breathalyze me or check for head injuries. It took most of the night to get my rig back on the road. By the time I pulled into Boise the next afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. The stress, the storm, the crash, they'd all combined to play one hell of a trick on my mind. But as I was unloading, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There on the side of my trailer were 3 long gouges in the metal. They were deep, running parallel to each other, spaced about 2 feet apart, just like claw marks. Claw marks from something impossibly large. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I'll tell you this, I don't drive those mountain passes at night anymore. And whenever I hear a wolf howl in the distance, a part of me wonders if it's really a wolf or something else. Something ancient and powerful that most people have forgotten, but that still roams the wild places of the world. So if you're ever driving through the Cascades on a snowy night and you see something big moving in your rearview mirror, don't slow down. Don't stop. Just keep driving and pray you're faster than what's chasing you. Because out there in the mountains, in the deep dark of night, there are things that hunger, things that chase. And if they catch you, you might just become another mysterious disappearance, another unsolved mystery in the annals of these old mountains. As for me, I still drive. It's my job, after all. But I keep an eye on my mirrors, especially at night. And I never ever take that mountain pass if there's even a hint of snow in the forecast. Some chases, once started, never really end. They just wait for the right moment to begin again. I never believed in ghosts until my truck started driving itself. Now, I'm not so sure what to believe anymore. The first time it happened, I thought I was losing my mind. I had just pulled into a rest stop off I-80, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. It was close to midnight, and I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight. My eyes were heavy, my back ached, and the caffeine from my last gas station coffee had worn off hours ago. I needed sleep, badly. I remember parking my rig in the far corner of the lot, away from the other trucks. Force of habit, I guess. I always liked my space. The lot was mostly empty anyway, just a couple of other semis and a minivan with a family sleeping inside. I did my usual routine, locked the doors, drew the curtains, and climbed into the sleeper cab. As I lay there, I could hear the distant hum of engines from the highway and the occasional crunch of gravel as another vehicle pulled in. The familiar sounds usually lulled me to sleep, but that night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the rumble of my own engine. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I was disoriented. The cab was dark, save for the faint glow of the dashboard lights. I blinked, trying to clear my head. That's when I realized we were moving. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to the front, nearly falling as the truck swayed. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed the wheel, ready to take control, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The wheel was turning by itself. I sat there, frozen, watching as the steering wheel moved smoothly left and right, guiding us down the highway. The pedals were depressing on their own, maintaining a steady speed of 65 miles per hour. Outside, the dark landscape of Nebraska rolled by, illuminated only by our headlights and the occasional passing car. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice shaky. I pinched myself hard. This had to be a dream, right? But the pain was real, and so was the terror coursing through my veins. I tried to take control, gripping the wheel tightly and attempting to steer. It wouldn't budge. It was like trying to bend steel with my bare hands. The pedals were the same. When I pressed on the brake, it felt like stepping on solid concrete. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of new autopilot system? Had I accidentally activated something? But that was impossible. My rig was a 2010 Peterbilt 389, not exactly cutting-edge technology. There was no autopilot, no self-driving capability, just good old-fashioned American steel in my own two hands. I reached for my phone, intending to call, well, I don't know who, the police, my dispatcher, the Ghostbusters. But as soon as I touched it, the screen went black. Dead. I tried the CB radio next, but all I got was static. For hours, I sat there in the driver's seat, alternating between attempts to regain control and periods of stunned silence. The truck drove flawlessly, better than I ever could. It navigated turns with precision, slowed down in construction zones, and even changed lanes to let faster vehicles pass. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead. To my surprise, the truck began to slow down and signal. It pulled off the highway smoothly, coming to a perfect stop in an empty parking spot. The engine cut off, and suddenly everything was still. I sat there, hands shaking, sweat soaking through my shirt. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached for the wheel. This time it turned easily under my touch. I pressed the pedals. They moved normally. Whatever force had been controlling the truck was gone. I stumbled out of the cab on wobbly legs, gulping in the cool morning air. The rest stop was quiet, with just a few early risers milling about. To them, I must have looked like any other trucker stretching his legs after a long night drive. If only they knew. I walked around the truck, inspecting it closely. There were no signs of tampering, no strange devices attached. It was just my same old rig, the one I'd been driving for years. The only difference was the odometer. We'd covered over 400 miles while I slept. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, it's happened 5 more times. Always at night. Always when I'm exhausted and pull over to sleep. I've tried everything, staying awake, tying myself to the seat, even removing the battery. Nothing works. When night falls and my eyes grow heavy, the truck comes to life. At first, I was terrified, but as time went on, a part of me started to feel grateful. I know how dangerous drowsy driving can be. How many times had I pushed myself to the limit trying to make a deadline? How many close calls had I had, jerking awake just in time to avoid disaster? Now I get the rest I need, and the deliveries are always on time. The truck never speeds, never makes a mistake. It's like having the world's best co-driver, one that only shows up when I need it most. But the questions still gnaw at me. How is this possible? Why me? And most importantly, who or what is really behind the wheel? I've started talking to it, believe it or not. When I feel the familiar sensation of control slipping away, I'll lean back in the seat and start chatting. I tell it about my day, about the family I'm hoping to see soon, about my dreams of saving up enough to buy my own rig someday. I don't know if it's listening, but it feels good to talk. One night, about a month after it all started, something changed. I was in the middle of telling the truck about my daughter's upcoming school play when I noticed we were slowing down. We pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, which was unusual. Normally, we only stopped at rest areas. Confused, I peered out the windshield. About a quarter mile ahead, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. As we crept closer, I saw what had happened, a bad pileup involving several cars and another semi. We stopped about 100 yards from the accident. I watched as paramedics rushed around, tending to the injured. Police officers directed the trickle of traffic around the scene. And then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A car was pulled over on the opposite shoulder, its hazard lights blinking. A woman stood next to it, waving her arms frantically. In the dim light of the highway lamps, I could see the panic on her face. Without thinking, I reached for the door handle. To my surprise, it opened easily. I jumped out and ran across the highway, dodging the slow-moving cars. "What's wrong?" I called as I approached the woman. "My husband," she cried, pointing to the man slumped in the driver's seat. "He's having a heart attack. I can't get a signal on my phone and nobody's stopping." I helped her get her husband out of the car and onto the ground. 2 years of EMT training before I became a trucker kicked in and I started CPR. "Go flag down one of the paramedics from the accident," I told the woman. She nodded and ran towards the flashing lights. For what felt like an eternity, I kept the rhythm, compressions, breaths. My arms ached, my back screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I heard sirens approaching. A paramedic took over, and soon they had the man stabilized and in an ambulance. As they drove away, the woman hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved his life." I walked back to my truck in a daze, my mind reeling from what had just happened. As I climbed into the cab, a thought struck me. If the truck hadn't stopped when it did, if it had just continued on like it usually did, I never would have seen that woman. Her husband might have died on the side of the road. I settled into the driver's seat, my hands resting lightly on the wheel. "Thanks," I said softly, feeling a little foolish, but needing to say it all the same. I don't know if you planned that or if it was just luck, but thanks. The engine started up, a low, comforting rumble. As we pulled back onto the highway, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I still didn't understand what was happening with my truck, and maybe I never would. But I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone out here on the long, dark highway. These days, I don't fight it anymore when I feel control slipping away. I just close my eyes, let the gentle rocking of the cab lull me to sleep, and trust that whatever's driving knows where we need to go. And sometimes, in my dreams, I could swear I hear a voice, soft, kind, and somehow familiar, saying, "Rest easy, partner, I've got the wheel." The first time I saw the accident, I stopped to help. The second time, I called 911. By the fifth time, I was starting to lose my mind. It always happens at mile marker 237 on I-80, just outside of Kearney, Nebraska. A red pickup truck crumpled against the guardrail. A blue sedan flipped on its roof, wheels still spinning. And in the middle of it all, a figure stumbling through the wreckage, waving their arms frantically. My name's Mike, and I've been driving trucks for 20 years. I've seen my fair share of accidents, but nothing like this. Nothing that haunts me every time I close my eyes. It started 3 weeks ago. I was on my usual route, hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Sacramento. It was a clear night, stars twinkling overhead, the kind of night that makes you glad to be on the open road. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard, 2:37 a.m. That's when I saw the flare of brake lights ahead, followed by the sickening screech of metal on metal. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed on the brakes, the trailer behind me groaning in protest. As soon as my rig screeched to a halt, I was out of the cab, fumbling for the flashlight I keep in the door pocket. The scene that greeted me was chaos. The pickup truck had plowed into the guardrail, its front end accordioned like a crushed beer can. About 50 feet away, the sedan lay on its roof, glass glittering on the asphalt like a carpet of broken stars. And there, in the middle of it all, was a man. He was middle-aged, balding, wearing a rumpled suit that was torn and bloodied. He stumbled towards me, his eyes wide with panic. "Help!" he croaked, his voice raw. "Please, my wife! My daughter!" I ran towards the overturned sedan, my heart pounding. I could hear whimpers coming from inside. I dropped to my knees, shining my flashlight into the wreckage. A woman hung upside down, held in place by her seatbelt. In the back, a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, was crying softly. "Hold on," I called to them. "Help is coming. Just hold on." I turned back to the man, intending to tell him to call 911, but he was gone. Confused, I scanned the area, thinking maybe he'd gone to check on the driver of the pickup. But there was no sign of him. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I stayed with the woman and child, talking to them, trying to keep them calm until the paramedics arrived. It wasn't until much later, after giving my statement to the police, that I realized something odd. No one had mentioned the man in the suit. When I asked about him, the officer just looked at me strangely and said there was no third person involved in the accident. I chalked it up to the stress of the situation. Maybe I'd imagined him. It had been a long day after all. I got back in my truck and continued on my way, shaken but glad I'd been able to help. A week later, I was making the return trip. Same route, same time of night. As I approached mile marker 237, a chill ran down my spine. There, in the road ahead, was the same scene. The red pickup crumpled against the guardrail, the blue sedan on its roof, and the man in the suit waving his arms frantically. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there. My hands shook as I pulled over, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. "There's been an accident on I-80, I told the dispatcher, my voice trembling. "Mile marker 237, at least 2 vehicles involved." "Sir," the dispatcher said, sounding confused, "we don't have any reports of an accident in that area. Are you sure about what you're seeing?" I looked out my windshield. The scene was still there, clear as day. "I'm looking right at it," I insisted. "Please, just send someone." "All right, sir. We'll send a patrol car to check it out. Please stay where you are." I sat in my truck watching the scene. The man in the suit paced back and forth, occasionally glancing my way. But he never approached my truck, never called out for help like he had the first time. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up behind me, lights flashing. An officer approached my window. "Everything okay here?" he asked, shining his flashlight into my cab. I pointed towards the accident scene. "The crash," I said. "Right there." The officer looked where I was pointing, then back at me. His face was a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sir, there's no accident here. The road is clear." I whipped my head around to look. He was right. The road was empty. No pickup, no sedan, no man in a suit. Just an empty stretch of highway. The officer asked me a few more questions, shined a light in my eyes, made me walk in a straight line. I could tell he thought I was drunk or on something. Finally, seemingly satisfied that I wasn't intoxicated, he let me go with a warning to get some rest at the next truck stop. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the accident. The crumpled pickup, the overturned sedan, the man in the suit waving desperately for help. It happened again the next week, and the week after that. Always at mile marker 237, always at 2:37 a.m., always the same. Sometimes I stopped. Sometimes I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, tears streaming down my face. I tried to switch routes, but my dispatcher just laughed when I told her why. I called the police station in Kearney, asking if there had ever been an accident like the one I kept seeing. They said no, nothing in their records. I even reached out to a local historian, wondering if maybe I was seeing some kind of echo of a past event. But there was nothing. It's been 3 weeks now since the first time. I'm sitting in a truck stop just outside of Kearney, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me. It's 2:15 a.m. In about 20 minutes, I'll have to drive past mile marker 237 again. Part of me wants to pull over before I reach it, park on the shoulder and wait until 238 just to see if I can avoid it. But another part of me, a part I don't quite understand, needs to see it again, needs to try one more time to make sense of it all. A young waitress stops by my table, coffee pot in hand. "You okay, honey?" she asks, concern etching her features. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I manage a weak smile. "Just tired," I lie. "Long haul, you know how it is." She nods sympathetically and tops off my cup. As she turns to leave, I catch sight of a photo pinned to the bulletin board behind the counter. My breath catches in my throat. It's him, the man in the suit. He's smiling in the photo, his arm around a woman. A little girl stands in front of them, beaming at the camera. They look happy, normal, alive. "Excuse me," I call to the waitress, my voice shaking. "That photo on the board. Who is that?" She glances at it, her face falling. "Oh, that's the Johnsons, local family. They died in a car crash about a year ago. Awful thing. We keep their photo up to remember them." My mind reels. A year ago. But I've been seeing them for weeks. Seeing him. The crash, I managed to croak out. "Where did it happen?" "Out on I-80, she replies. "You know that big curve just past mile marker 237? Right there. They say Mr. Johnson fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the center line and hit a pickup truck head on. All three of them died instantly." I stare at her, my mouth dry, my heart pounding. She mistakes my shock for simple sadness at the story. "I'm sorry," she says gently. "I didn't mean to upset you, it's just, well, it shook up the whole town pretty bad. Mr. Johnson was always trying to help people, you know? Even at the end, they say he was more worried about the other driver than himself." I nod numbly, unable to speak. She gives me a sad smile and moves on to the next table. I look at my watch. 2:33 a.m. In 4 minutes, I'll be passing mile marker 237 again. In 4 minutes, I'll see the accident. See him. But this time, I think I understand. This time, I know what I need to do. As I climb into my truck, my hands are steady for the first time in weeks. I start the engine, the familiar rumble comforting me as I pull out onto the highway. Mile marker 235 passes, then 236. As 237 looms ahead, I see the flare of brake lights. Hear the screech of metal, but this time, I'm ready. I pull over and jump out of my cab. The man in the suit is there, waving his arms. But this time, instead of running to the car, I walk straight up to him. "Mr. Johnson," I say softly, "it's okay. You can rest now. They're waiting for you." He stops, staring at me with wide eyes. For a moment, just a moment, I see relief flood his face. Then he smiles, a real smile, not the grimace of pain I've seen these past weeks. He nods once, and then he's gone. The pickup, the sedan, all of it gone. I stand there on the empty highway, tears streaming down my face. But for the first time in weeks, they're tears of relief. As I climb back into my truck, I glance in my rearview mirror. For just a second, I swear I see 3 figures standing by the side of the road. A man, a woman, and a little girl. They're smiling and waving, not in panic or fear, but in farewell. I lift my hand to wave back, but they're already gone. The road behind me is empty. I put my truck in gear and pull back onto the highway. Mile marker 238 passes, then 239. I drive on into the night, finally at peace. Some say the long haul can drive a person crazy. Maybe they're right. Or maybe, just maybe, it shows us things we need to see. Things we need to understand. All I know is I'll never look at mile marker 237 the same way again. And somewhere out there, I hope a family has finally found their way home. The voice on the CB radio was as clear as day, but the man behind it had been dead for 30 years. I first heard him on a moonless night somewhere in the Nevada desert, my rig cutting through the darkness like a ship through black water. The clock on my dash read 11:58 p.m., and I was 2 hours away from my next rest stop. My name's Sarah, and I've been hauling freight across the American Southwest for the better part of a decade. I thought I'd seen it all. Dust storms that turned day to night, mirages that made you swear there was an oasis just ahead, even a few UFOs, though I'm pretty sure those were just military planes from the nearby base. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. The CB crackled to life, startling me out of the highway hypnosis that had begun to set in. Most drivers these days use cell phones, but I've always had a soft spot for the old tech. There's something comforting about the static, the distant voices keeping you company on a lonely stretch of road. Breaker 1, 9, this is Midnight Rider. Anybody got their ears on? The voice was deep, gravelly, with a hint of a southern drawl. Nothing unusual there, plenty of good old boys still running the roads. I reached for the mic, ready to respond, when he continued. I'm looking for my Eleanor. Anybody seen her? Red 85 Max Superliner. Eleanor, painted on the door. She should have been through here by now. I frowned. An 85 Mac? Those were practically antiques. You might see one in a truck show, but not on a working route, and definitely not out here in the middle of nowhere. Before I could key up, another voice chimed in. Midnight Rider, this is Long Haul Larry. Ain't seen no Eleanor, but I'll keep my eyes peeled. Where you at, good buddy? I'm about 20 miles east of Tonopah, the first voice replied. Been waiting here for days. Eleanor was supposed to meet me, but she never showed. I'm starting to worry. A chill ran down my spine. 20 miles east of Tonopah? That's exactly where I was. But there were no other trucks on the road, no lights ahead or behind me. Just endless darkness and the ribbon of asphalt illuminated by my headlights. I glanced at my phone, thinking about looking up this Midnight Rider. But out here in the dead zone between towns, I had no signal, just me, my truck, and the CB radio. Breaker 1, 9, I finally said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. This is Desert Rose. I'm 20 miles east of Tonopah too, but I don't see anyone else out here. You sure about your location, Midnight Rider? Static filled the channel for a long moment. Then, I'm sure, Desert Rose. Been here so long, feels like I'm part of the landscape now. You really don't see me? I'm right by the big Joshua tree, the one that looks like it's reaching for the stars. I peered out into the darkness. There were Joshua trees everywhere, their twisted forms looking like something out of a Dr. Seuss book in the glow of my headlights, but none that stood out as particularly big or star-reaching. Sorry, Midnight Rider, I replied. Don't see any special Joshua trees. Maybe we're not in the same spot after all. Nah, you're in the right place, Desert Rose, he said, his voice tinged with sadness. You just can't see me. Not many can these days. The conversation was starting to unnerve me. I was about to sign off when Long Haul Larry's voice came back on the channel. Hey, Midnight Rider, I just looked you up on my phone. There's an old news article here, says a trucker with the handle Midnight Rider went missing 30 years ago, right outside of Tonopah. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it? My blood ran cold. 30 years ago? That's impossible. The voice on the radio sounded as clear as if the guy was sitting right next to me. The channel was silent for a long moment. Then Midnight Rider spoke again, his voice softer now, almost wistful. 30 years, huh? Guess time flies when you're waiting for your love. Yeah, Larry, I reckon that's me. James the Midnight Rider Callahan at your service, or what's left of me anyway. I wanted to turn off the radio, to dismiss this as some elaborate prank or a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the raw emotion in Midnight Rider's voice. Whatever it was, I found myself keying up the mic again. Midnight Rider, James, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What happened to you? Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with memory. It was a night just like this one, clear skies, stars so bright you could almost reach out and touch them. Eleanor and I, we'd been on the road together for years, not just partners in trucking, but in life. We were going to get married, settle down, maybe buy our own rig. He sighed, a sound full of regret and longing. We had a system, Eleanor and I. Always kept each other in sight, never more than a few miles apart. But that night she radioed that she was having engine trouble. Told me to go on ahead, said she'd catch up. I didn't want to leave her, but she insisted. Said she'd be fine, that she'd see me at the next truck stop, so I went on ahead. Waited for hours, but she never showed. I tried radioing her, but got no response. Finally, I turned back. His voice cracked, and for a moment all I could hear was static. When he continued, his words were barely above a whisper. I found her truck off the road, hidden behind a stand of Joshua trees. The engine was cold. Eleanor was gone. No sign of her, no note, nothing. I searched for hours, calling her name until my voice gave out. As the sun came up, I realized I needed help. So I got back in my rig, intending to drive to the nearest town and call the police. Another pause. I realized I was holding my breath, dreading what came next. "I never made it," James said softly. "Last thing I remember is the glare of headlights in my mirror, then a tremendous impact. Next thing I knew, I was here, watching my own rig burn, watching the police and ambulances come and go, watching them take what was left of me away." I felt a tear roll down my cheek. "Oh, James," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry for me, Desert Rose," he replied. "I've had 30 years to make peace with my fate, but Eleanor, she's still out there somewhere. I can feel it. That's why I'm still here, still calling out on this old CB, hoping that someday she'll hear me and come back." As he spoke, I noticed something in the distance, a glint of metal just off the road. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating a shape I hadn't seen before. A truck, its red paint faded and peeling, half buried in the sand. My heart pounding, I pulled over and grabbed my flashlight. As I approached the wreck, I saw faded letters on the door. "Eleanor." With shaking hands, I keyed up the mic. "James," I said, my voice trembling. I think I found her." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. "Thank you, Desert Rose. I think it's time for us to go home now." The CB erupted in a burst of static so loud it made me jump. When it cleared, the channel was silent. No matter how many times I called out, there was no response from Midnight Rider or Long Haul Larry. I reported the found truck to the authorities, of course. They were able to trace it back to an Eleanor Simmons, reported missing 30 years ago along with her fiancé, James Callahan. Both cases had gone cold decades ago. As I gave my statement to the police, I debated whether to tell them about the CB conversation. In the end, I kept it to myself. Some things, I figured, are better left unexplained. These days, I still drive the Tonopah route sometimes, and every time I pass that spot, I key up the mic and call out, "Breaker 1-9, this is Desert Rose. Midnight Rider Eleanor, you out there?" I never get a response. But sometimes, just as I'm about to give up, I swear I can hear two voices, faint but happy, singing an old country song together. And for just a moment, I see two sets of taillights in my rearview mirror driving off into eternity, side by side at last. They appeared in my rearview mirror at 2:17 a.m., two piercing white lights that had no business being on this godforsaken stretch of highway. By sunrise, I'd be convinced they weren't from this world at all. The name's Jack, and I've been driving big rigs for nearly 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road. Drunk drivers zigzagging like they're in a slalom race. Debris that seems to materialize out of thin air, even a few things I can't explain. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened that night on Route 50 in Nevada. They don't call it the loneliest road in America for nothing. Miles and miles of nothing but sage-studded desert and asphalt stretching to the horizon. Most nights, I don't see another vehicle for hours. It's just me, my 18-wheeler, and whatever audiobook is keeping me company. That night, I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver. Clear skies, a sliver of moon hanging low in the sky. The kind of night where you can see every star in the galaxy. I had my windows cracked, letting in the cool desert air that smelled of dust and distant rain. I first noticed the lights around 2:17 a.m., just a pinprick in my mirror at first, so faint I thought I was imagining things. But as the minutes ticked by, they grew larger, brighter, two intense white beams perfectly parallel. Finally, some company, I muttered to myself, settling in for the inevitable game of leapfrog that happens when two vehicles share an empty road. But the lights didn't get any closer. For 10 minutes, 20, 30, they maintained the exact same distance behind me, close enough to make out clearly, but never near enough to see the vehicle they were attached to. I squinted at my mirror, trying to make out the shape of a car or truck behind the glare. Nothing. Just those two unwavering lights, floating in the darkness like a pair of misplaced stars. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the warm night. Something wasn't right. I'd been doing 70 miles per hour this whole time. Whatever was behind me should have either caught up or fallen back by now. I eased off the gas, letting my speed drop to 65, then 60. The lights slowed too, maintaining that same maddening distance. "All right," I growled. Let's see how you like this. I stomped on the accelerator, pushing my rig up to 80. The engine roared in protest, but the truck surged forward. The lights kept pace effortlessly. My heart was pounding now, my palms slick with sweat on the wheel. This wasn't possible. Nothing should be able to match a big rig's acceleration like that, going from 60 to 80 in seconds. I grabbed my CB radio. Breaker 1, 9, this is Big Jack. Anybody out there? Over. Static was my only reply. I tried again and again, nothing but the hiss of dead air. I checked my cell phone next. No signal, of course not. I was in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. The lights were still there, those twin beacons boring into my mirrors. I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching me, studying me. My skin crawled at the thought. That's when things got really weird. I saw a sign for a rest area coming up. Normally I wouldn't stop. I had miles to go before I slept, as the poem goes. But I needed to put some distance between me and whatever was behind me. I flicked on my turn signal and began to decelerate. The lights behind me dimmed slightly, and for a moment I thought they were falling back. Then they flared, impossibly bright, filling my cab with harsh white light. I yelled, more in surprise than pain, and instinctively yanked the wheel to the right. My rig shuddered as the wheels hit the rumble strip. I overcorrected, swerving back onto the road, then off again. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure I was going to jackknife. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. My eyes, dazzled by the glare, struggled to adjust to the darkness. When they did, I realized two things. I had somehow kept the truck on the road, and the lights behind me were gone. I let out a shaky breath, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. What the hell just happened? The rest area sign flashed by, but I was too rattled to stop now. I needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between me and whatever that was, as possible. For the next hour, I drove in silence, my eyes flicking constantly to my mirrors. No more lights appeared, just the empty road behind me, swallowed by darkness. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead. I knew I needed to stop soon, lights or no lights. That's when I saw it. A truck stop, its neon sign a beacon of normalcy in the desert night. I've never been so happy to see an overpriced gas station in my life. I pulled in, my legs shaky as I climbed down from the cab. The lot was mostly empty, a couple of other trucks, a few cars. Normal, sane. I made my way inside, the fluorescent lights harsh after hours of darkness. "Rough night?" the clerk asked as I approached the counter with a coffee and a sandwich. I must have looked worse than I thought. "You could say that," I replied, trying to smile. "Hey, you haven't heard any reports of strange lights on the highway, have you?" The clerk, his name tag read Dave, raised an eyebrow. "Strange lights? What, like UFOs or something?" I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my own ears. "Nah, nothing like that. Just weird headlights, I guess. Probably nothing." Dave shrugged. "Highway Patrol hasn't reported anything, but hey, you never know out here. Nevada's a weird place, especially at night." I nodded, paid for my stuff, and headed back to my truck. As I approached, I noticed something odd. There was a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My heart rate picked up as I unfolded it. It was a map, hand-drawn in what looked like silver ink. It showed Route 50, with a spot marked about 50 miles ahead. Next to it was a time, 5:47 a.m. I checked my watch, 4:32 a.m. If I left now and maintained my usual speed, I'd reach that spot at almost exactly 5:47. I stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling in my hands. Part of me wanted to crumple it up, climb in my cab, and drive in the opposite direction as fast as I could. But a larger part, the part that had kept me on the road all these years, needed to know what was going on. At 4:45 a.m., I pulled out of the truck stop. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading as dawn approached. I kept a white-knuckled grip on the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and my mirrors. No lights appeared behind me. The miles ticked by, each one ratcheting up the tension in my shoulders. What would I find? What if nothing happened? What if something did? At 5:45, I saw it, a turnoff up ahead, right where the map indicated. A dirt road leading off into the desert. As I approached, I saw something else. Two vehicles parked just off the highway, a red pickup truck and a silver sedan. I slowed down, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was it. This was where... What? What did I expect to happen? As I drew closer, I saw two figures standing by the vehicles. They were looking up at the sky, pointing at something. I followed their gaze. There, hovering above the desert, were two brilliant white lights. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I put the truck in park. As if in a dream, I got out and walked towards the figures. They turned as I approached. A man and a woman, both middle-aged, with expressions of wonder on their faces. "You saw them too?" the woman asked as I got closer. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "They've been coming here for weeks," the man said. "Always at the same time, always in the same spot. We thought we were going crazy until we found others online who'd seen them too." "What are they?" I managed to croak out. The woman shook her head. "We don't know, but they're not hostile. They've never tried to hurt anyone. They just watch. And sometimes they lead people here." As if on cue, the lights began to move. They dipped low, almost touching the desert floor, then rose again. They spiraled around each other in an intricate dance, leaving trails of light in the pre-dawn sky. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and utterly alien. For 10 minutes we stood there in silence, watching the impossible display above us. Then, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the lights winked out as if they had never been. I looked at the couple. They were smiling, tears in their eyes. "Same time tomorrow?" the man asked. I thought about my route, my deadlines, my normal life that suddenly seemed so small and unimportant. "Yeah," I heard myself say. "Same time tomorrow." As I climbed back into my truck, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake. The lonely road ahead didn't seem so lonely anymore. Whatever those lights were, wherever they came from, they had shown me that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than I had ever imagined. I started the engine, my mind already racing ahead to tomorrow night. In my rearview mirror, the couple waved goodbye. Above them, the morning sky was empty, holding its secrets for another day. But I knew now. We all knew. We weren't alone out here on the loneliest road in America. Not anymore. The stench hit me first. As I swung open the trailer doors, the sickly sweet odor of decay rushed out like a foul wind, nearly knocking me off my feet. My stomach churned, threatening to spill my earlier truck stop coffee onto the cracked asphalt. But it wasn't the smell that made my blood run cold. It was what I saw inside. I've been driving big rigs for over 2 decades now, crisscrossing the country more times than I can count. I've seen my fair share of weird shit out on the lonely highways and back roads. Hell, I've even had a few brushes with what you might call the supernatural. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I found in that abandoned trailer on a foggy night just outside of Tulsa. It was around 2 a.m. when I pulled into the old truck stop. The place looked like it had seen better days. Paint peeling off the walls, weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete, and not another soul in sight. But I was dead tired and needed to catch some shut-eye before continuing my haul to Chicago. As I maneuvered my rig into a spot near the back of the lot, my headlights swept across something that made me do a double take. There, partially hidden behind an overgrown hedge, was a lone trailer. No cab in sight, just the trailer sitting there like someone had forgotten about it. Now, I'm not usually one to go poking my nose where it doesn't belong, but something about that trailer nagged at me. Maybe it was the way it seemed to shimmer slightly in the fog, or how the air around it felt heavier somehow. Whatever it was, I found myself climbing out of my cab and walking towards it, flashlight in hand. The trailer was an older model, its once white paint now a dirty gray streaked with rust. No company logos or identification numbers, just a blank canvas of neglect. I ran my hand along its side, feeling the rough texture of corrosion under my fingertips. That's when I noticed the padlock on the rear doors. It was brand new. The shiny brass stood out like a sore thumb against the weathered metal of the trailer. My curiosity, already piqued, now went into overdrive. What the hell was a new lock doing on this piece of junk? I tugged at it half-heartedly, not really expecting anything to happen. To my surprise, it came away in my hand with a soft click. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized someone had locked this thing recently and hadn't bothered to secure it properly. That's when the smell hit me. I gagged, stumbling back a few steps as I fought to keep my dinner down. It was like a mix of rotting meat and something chemical, sharp and acrid. My eyes watered as I struggled to catch my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to get back in my truck and pretend I'd never seen this godforsaken trailer. But I couldn't. That same morbid curiosity that had drawn me here in the first place now demanded I see this through. With trembling hands, I grasped the handle of the trailer door and pulled it open. The interior was pitch black, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the inky darkness. As my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a jumble of oddly shaped furniture, all piled haphazardly throughout the trailer. Then one of the shapes moved. I nearly dropped my flashlight as I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest. I swept the beam across the interior again, slower this time, and that's when the true horror of what I was seeing began to sink in. They weren't furniture at all. They were bodies. Dozens of them twisted and contorted into impossible positions, piled on top of each other like discarded rag dolls. Some were little more than skeletons, while others looked fresher. But it was their faces that haunted me the most. Each one was frozen in a rictus of terror, eyes wide and mouths agape in silent screams. Whatever had happened to these people, their final moments had been filled with unimaginable horror. I wanted to run. God, how I wanted to run. But my feet felt rooted to the spot as my flashlight beam danced across the nightmarish scene. That's when I saw something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. One of the bodies was moving. It was subtle at first, just a slight twitch of a finger. But as I watched, paralyzed with fear, the movement became more pronounced. An arm jerked spasmodically, a leg kicked out, and then, with agonizing slowness, the head began to turn towards me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, flashlight beam shaking wildly, as the thing that should not be alive fixed its gaze upon me. Its eyes were milky white, devoid of pupils or irises. The skin was a sickly gray, pulled tight across prominent cheekbones. And when its jaw dropped open, revealing blackened teeth and a swollen tongue, I knew I was looking at something that had long since shuffled off this mortal coil. Yet it moved, it lived, and it was looking right at me. A sound escaped its throat, a dry, rattling wheeze that might have been an attempt at speech. Other bodies began to stir, limbs twitching and heads lolling as whatever unholy force animated them began to take hold. That's when my survival instinct finally kicked in. I slammed the trailer doors shut, fumbling with the padlock as I tried to secure it with shaking hands. Behind me, I could hear a growing chorus of those terrible wheezing sounds, punctuated by the dull thud of bodies hitting the metal walls. I ran back to my truck, heart threatening to burst from my chest. As I climbed into the cab, I risked one last glance at the trailer. In the pale glow of the truck stop's flickering lights, I could have sworn I saw the entire thing shudder, as if whatever was inside was trying to break free. I peeled out of that truck stop like the hounds of hell were on my tail, tires squealing as I fishtailed onto the empty highway. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Were they zombies? Victims of some twisted experiment? Or something even worse, some eldritch horror beyond human comprehension? As the miles flew by and the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I started to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? The human mind can play tricks, especially when you're tired and alone on a dark highway. Maybe it had all been some vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much gas station coffee. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen in that trailer was real, and it was still out there. I drove straight through to Chicago without stopping, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel the entire time. When I finally reached my destination and handed over my cargo, my coworkers commented on how pale and shaken I looked. I brushed off their concerns, muttering something about a bad batch of truck stop chili. That night, as I lay in my motel room staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of those bodies. The smell, the sound of that thing trying to speak. Sleep was elusive, and when it finally came, it was filled with nightmares of rotting hands reaching for me from the darkness. The next morning, I called the police. I gave them the location of the truck stop and tried to explain what I'd seen. The bored-sounding dispatcher on the other end of the line took down my information, but I could tell she didn't believe a word of it. Probably thought I was some burnout trucker who'd had one too many bennies to stay awake on the road. For weeks afterward, I scoured the news for any mention of a grisly discovery at an abandoned truck stop near Tulsa. But there was nothing. Not a single word about bodies found in a trailer or an investigation into missing persons. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I heard. And every time I pass a lone trailer on the side of the road, I can't help but wonder, what's inside? Are there more out there, scattered across the country like time bombs waiting to go off? And what happens when whatever's inside finally breaks free? I still drive trucks for a living. It's all I know how to do. But now I stick to busy routes and well-lit truck stops. I don't pull over on lonely stretches of highway anymore, no matter how tired I am. And I never, ever investigate anything unusual I might see along the way. Because out there on the dark highways of America, there are things that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do, and sometimes they're just waiting for some poor, curious soul to open the door and let them out. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see a trailer sitting all alone in an abandoned lot, do yourself a favor. Keep driving, don't stop, don't look back. And whatever you do, don't open the door, because you never know what might be waiting inside. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. I blinked hard, splashed some water on my face, and looked again. Still there, those dark, hollow eyes boring into me from a gaunt face I'd never seen before. I stumbled back from the truck stop bathroom sink, my heart pounding. This was just the beginning of a night that would change everything I thought I knew about reality. My name's Jack, and I've been hauling freight across the country for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my share of strange things out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night at the Crossroads truck stop just outside of Amarillo, Texas. It had been a long day of driving, the kind where the white lines on the highway start to blur together and you catch yourself drifting more times than you'd like to admit. By the time I pulled into Crossroads, my eyes were gritty with fatigue and my back was screaming from being hunched over the wheel for 14 hours straight. The place was like 100 other truck stops I'd seen. A weathered building squatting beside the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. A few other rigs were scattered across the cracked asphalt lot, their drivers likely catching some shut-eye or grabbing a quick meal inside. I parked my rig and climbed down from the cab, wincing as my stiff muscles protested the movement. The air was heavy with the scent of diesel and fry grease, a combination that usually made my stomach growl. Tonight, though, it just turned my gut. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Shaking off the feeling, I made my way inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over everything. A bored-looking cashier barely glanced up from her phone as I entered. In the attached diner, a couple of truckers hunched over plates of greasy food, not speaking. I headed straight for the bathroom, desperate to splash some water on my face and maybe feel human again. That's when things started to get weird. The face in the mirror wasn't mine, but as I stood there, frozen in shock, I realized it wasn't just a stranger staring back at me. The gaunt, hollow-eyed face seemed to be changing, shifting, like smoke caught in a glass, never quite settling into a single form. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 10, and looked again. This time I saw my own face, but it was wrong. Older, more weathered. Deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. I reached up to touch my cheek and the reflection did the same, but I couldn't feel the wrinkles I saw in the mirror. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice echoing in the empty bathroom. That's when I heard it. A low chuckle coming from one of the stalls behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the stalls were all empty. I checked each one, pushing the doors open with trembling hands. Nothing. When I turned back to the sink, the mirror was normal again. Just plain old Jack staring back at me, looking a bit pale and shaken, but otherwise the same as always. I splashed some water on my face, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of fatigue-induced hallucination. But as I left the bathroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, making my skin crawl. Every reflective surface I passed seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision. But when I looked directly at them, they were normal. I made my way to the diner, figuring some coffee and food might help clear my head. As I slid into a booth, I caught a glimpse of movement in the chrome napkin dispenser. For just a second, I could have sworn I saw that gaunt face again, grinning at me with too many teeth. The waitress appeared, startling me so badly I nearly knocked over the glass of water she'd set down. She gave me an odd look, but took my order without comment. As she walked away, I saw her reflection in the window. It wasn't her. It was that face again, turning to leer at me over its shoulder. I rubbed my eyes hard, telling myself I was just overtired. When I looked again, everything was normal, but I couldn't relax. Every time I glanced at a reflective surface and the chrome trim on the table, the glass of the pie display, even the polished buttons on my shirt, I caught fleeting glimpses of that face, sometimes grinning, sometimes screaming silently, always gone before I could focus on it. By the time my food arrived, I was a nervous wreck. My hands shook as I tried to eat, and every little sound made me jump. The other truckers in the diner were giving me strange looks, probably thinking I was tweaking or something. I forced myself to eat, keeping my eyes firmly on my plate. But I couldn't ignore the constant prickling sensation of being watched. It felt like the walls themselves had eyes, all of them fixed on me. When I finally looked up, the diner had changed. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting deep shadows in the corners. The other truckers were gone, leaving me alone in the suddenly cavernous space. And every reflective surface, windows, chrome, polished tables, showed that face. Dozens of copies of it, all staring at me with those hollow eyes and two wide grins. I bolted from the booth, nearly upending the table in my haste. I had to get out of there. Had to get back to my truck and put this place in my rearview mirror. But as I rushed towards the exit, I realized with growing horror that the faces weren't just in the reflections anymore. They were on the actual people. The bored cashier, now wide awake and grinning that impossible grin. The waitress, her features melting and reforming into that gaunt visage as she reached for me with elongated fingers. I burst out of the truck stop, gasping for air. The night had grown impossibly dark, the few security lights doing little to push back the inky blackness. I stumbled towards where I thought I'd parked my rig, but the lot seemed bigger now, stretching off into shadow. Other trucks loomed in the darkness, their chrome and glass glinting. In every reflection, that face watched me, grinning, beckoning. I spun in circles, trying to find my truck, but everything looked wrong, distorted, like I was seeing it all through a funhouse mirror. I heard laughter then. Not the warm chuckle of someone sharing a joke, but a cold, mirthless sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It grew louder, echoing off the trucks and the building behind me, surrounding me in a cacophony of madness. "What do you want?" I screamed into the night. "What the hell is happening?" The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it hurt my ears. Then a voice, raspy and dry, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "We want you, Jack," it said. "We've always wanted you." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. My lungs burned as I sprinted across the parking lot, feet pounding on the cracked asphalt. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't seem to reach the edge of the lot. It was like trying to outrun my own shadow. Trucks loomed out of the darkness, their surfaces rippling like water. In every reflection, that face watched me, grinning, always grinning. I could hear footsteps behind me now, a shuffling gait that was somehow keeping pace despite my frantic sprint. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. A figure was following me, its form constantly shifting and changing. One moment it was the cashier, the next the waitress, then other faces I didn't recognize, but always with those same hollow eyes and too wide grin. I put on an extra burst of speed, my heart feeling like it would explode in my chest. Up ahead, I finally saw it, my truck. A wave of relief washed over me as I reached for the door handle. But as my fingers touched the cool metal, the entire truck rippled like a mirage. The chrome and glass seemed to melt, running like quicksilver to pool on the ground. And rising from that liquid metal was that face, now the size of a billboard, its cavernous mouth opening wide to swallow me whole. I jerked my hand back with a cry, stumbling away from what used to be my truck. I turned to run again, but found myself surrounded. Dozens of figures stood in a circle around me, all wearing that same terrible face. They began to close in, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. "No," I whimpered, spinning in place, looking for any way out. "This can't be real. It can't be—" "Oh, but it is, Jack," that raspy voice said, seeming to come from all the figures at once. "This is the truest thing you've ever known." As they reached for me with grasping hands, I screwed my eyes shut and screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until I tasted blood. I screamed and woke up with a start, drenched in sweat and tangled in my sleeper cab's blankets. For a long moment I just sat there, gasping for breath and trying to get my bearings. I was in my truck, It was parked at a truck stop, but not Crossroads. This was a bustling Love's off I-40, full of travelers and other truckers going about their business in the early morning light. It had all been a dream, a vivid, terrifying nightmare, but just a dream. I laughed shakily, running a hand through my sweat-soaked hair. But as I climbed out of the sleeper to start my day, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror. Just for a second, I could have sworn I saw a gaunt face with hollow eyes grinning at me with too many teeth. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my own tired face looking back at me. But now, every time I look in a mirror, I can't help but wonder, what's really looking back? I never believed in the supernatural until the night my truck became a canvas for the unknown. The glowing symbols etched into its metal skin defied explanation, and as I traced their otherworldly patterns with trembling fingers, I knew my life as a simple long-haul trucker would never be the same. My name's Mike, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my share of weird shit out on the lonely highways crisscrossing this country, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. It was a run like any other, hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver. I'd done this route more times than I could count, and the familiar rhythm of the road had lulled me into a kind of trance. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving nothing but an endless sea of stars above and the occasional pinprick of light from a distant farmhouse. I was about halfway through Nevada when fatigue started to set in. My eyes were getting heavy and the white lines on the road were starting to blur together. I knew it was time to find a place to pull over and catch some shut-eye. That's when I saw it, a small truck stop just off the highway. The sign was old and faded, but I could just make out the words "Last Chance Gas" flickering weakly in neon. It wasn't much, but it was better than risking falling asleep at the wheel. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of stones under my tires seemingly amplified in the stillness of the night. The place looked deserted, no other vehicles in sight, and the little convenience store attached to the gas station was dark. But the pumps were lit up, so I figured it was one of those automated places. I maneuvered my rig into a spot at the edge of the lot, away from the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. As I killed the engine, the sudden silence was almost deafening. I hadn't realized how accustomed I'd become to the constant rumble of the road. I climbed down from the cab, my boots kicking up little puffs of dust as they hit the ground. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and something else I couldn't quite place. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, though I couldn't say why. I did a quick walk around the truck, checking the tires and making sure everything looked okay. It was a habit I'd developed over the years. Better to catch a problem now than find yourself stranded in the middle of nowhere. Everything seemed fine, so I headed back to the cab, ready to crawl into my sleeper and catch a few hours of rest. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some weird reflection from the gas station's fluorescence. But as I got closer, I realized with growing unease that something was very, very wrong. There, on the side of my trailer, were symbols. Dozens of them etched into the metal as if by some impossibly hot brand. They glowed with a faint, pulsing light that seemed to come from within the metal itself. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. I rubbed my eyes hard, certain I must be hallucinating from lack of sleep. But when I looked again, the symbols were still there, their eerie light casting strange shadows across the gravel lot. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture. The symbols showed up clearly on the screen, dispelling any hope that this was just some sort of optical illusion. I reached out to touch one of the markings, half expecting my hand to pass right through it. Instead, my fingers met cool metal. The symbol felt slightly raised, as if it had been carefully engraved into the surface of the trailer. But that was impossible. I checked the truck not half an hour ago, and there had been nothing unusual about it. As I traced the outline of one of the symbols, a jolt of static electricity zapped my fingertip. I jerked my hand back with a yelp, more from surprise than pain, but in that instant, something changed. The symbols began to move. It was subtle at first, just a slight shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. But then they started to shift and flow, rearranging themselves into new patterns. I watched, transfixed, as they swirled across the surface of the trailer like quicksilver. And then I heard it. a low, thrumming sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was coming from the cymbals themselves, a sound so deep and resonant that I felt it more than heard it. Panic gripped me. This was so far beyond anything I could explain or understand. I had to get out of there, had to put as much distance between myself and this, whatever it was, as possible. I scrambled back into the cab, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, not even bothering to buckle my seatbelt before I peeled out of the lot in a spray of gravel. As I pulled back onto the highway, I kept glancing in my side mirrors, half expecting to see the symbols spreading across the entire truck. But they remained confined to the trailer, their glow visible even at highway speeds. I drove like a man possessed, pushing the speed limit and then some. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and cold sweat trickled down my back. Every few minutes I'd check the mirrors, hoping against hope that the symbols would disappear as mysteriously as they'd appeared. But they didn't. If anything, they seemed to be getting brighter, their pulsing glow intensifying with each passing mile. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I spotted a sign for a rest area ahead. I needed to stop, needed to get a better look at what was happening to my truck in the light of day. I pulled into the rest area, which was mercifully empty save for a couple of cars whose drivers were likely catching some sleep. I parked as far away from them as possible, not wanting anyone else to see the impossible markings on my trailer. With the engine off, I could hear that thrumming sound again, louder now. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with its otherworldly resonance. I climbed out of the cab on shaky legs and made my way to the back of the trailer. In the growing light of dawn, the symbols were even more incredible and terrifying. They shimmered with an opalescent sheen, colors shifting and changing as I watched. And they were still moving, flowing across the surface of the trailer in complex patterns that hurt my eyes to look at for too long. It was like trying to read a language that was never meant for human eyes. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a realization hit me like a physical blow. The symbols weren't just on the outside of the trailer. I could see hints of that same ethereal glow coming from inside, visible through the small gaps around the rear doors. With trembling hands, I reached for the latch. Part of me was screaming to get back in the cab and drive away, to pretend none of this was happening. But a deeper part, a part I didn't even know existed until that moment, needed to see what was inside. The doors swung open with a creak that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn stillness. And there in the cavernous space of the trailer was a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The entire interior was covered in the glowing symbols, creating a dizzying, multidimensional space that seemed to go on forever. It was as if the inside of the trailer had become a portal to somewhere else. And in the center of it all, hovering in midair, was an object. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It seemed to shift and change every time I tried to focus on it, like smoke caught in a glass. But gradually, a shape began to emerge. It was a cube, but like no cube I'd ever seen. Its surfaces were covered in the same flowing symbols as the trailer, but these moved with purpose, forming and reforming into complex equations and diagrams that I could almost, but not quite, understand. As I watched, transfixed, the cube began to rotate slowly in the air. With each turn, I caught glimpses of other worlds, other realities flickering across its surfaces. Alien landscapes, impossible cities, creatures that defied description. All there and gone in the blink of an eye. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into that impossible space. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually a car door slamming somewhere in the rest area snapped me out of my trance. I quickly shut the trailer doors, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. As I made my way back to the cab on unsteady legs, I tried to make sense of it all. What were these symbols? Where had they come from? And what was that cube, that impossible object that seemed to contain entire universes within its shifting surfaces? I climbed into the driver's seat, my body moving on autopilot while my mind grappled with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. For a moment, just the briefest instant, I saw those same glowing symbols reflected in my eyes. I blinked and they were gone. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that whatever had marked my truck had marked me as well. My journey, I realized, was just beginning. As I pulled back onto the highway, the first rays of the sun cresting the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer just hauling cargo across the country. I was carrying something far more precious and far more dangerous. The cymbals on my truck pulsed in time with my heartbeat as I drove towards a future I could no longer predict. One thing was certain. My life as a simple trucker was over. What I was now, what I was becoming, remained to be seen. The rusty swing creaked in the wind, swaying gently despite the absence of any living child. I stood frozen at the edge of the rest area playground, my blood running cold as I watched the empty swing move back and forth, back and forth. That's when I heard it. A child's laughter, faint but unmistakable, carried on the chill night air. But the playground was deserted. I was alone, or so I thought. My name's Tony, and I've been driving trucks for going on 15 years now. I've seen my fair share of strange things out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that night at the Pinewood Rest Area just off I-80 in Nebraska. It had been a long haul from Chicago, and I was dead on my feet by the time I pulled into the rest stop. The clock on my dash read 2:17 a.m., and the place was deserted save for a couple of other trucks whose drivers were likely catching some shut-eye. I parked my rig and climbed down from the cab, wincing as my stiff muscles protested the movement. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, carrying the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from somewhere in the distance. I breathed deeply, glad to be out of the stuffy confines of my truck. My plan was simple. Hit the restroom, maybe grab a snack from the vending machines, and then catch a few hours of sleep before continuing on to Denver. But as I made my way across the parking lot, something caught my eye. Off to the side of the main building was a small playground. It wasn't much, just a couple of swings, a slide, and one of those spring-mounted horse things that kids love to bounce on. In the dim light cast by the lone security lamp, it looked sad and abandoned. I don't know what made me walk over there. Maybe it was the nostalgia of remembering my own kids when they were little, always begging to stop at playgrounds during our rare family road trips. Or maybe it was something else, some instinct I couldn't quite name. As I got closer, I noticed how run down everything looked. The paint on the slide was peeling, and rust had eaten away at the chains of the swings. It was clear this playground hadn't seen any love in a long time. That's when I heard it, the creak of metal on metal. One of the swings was moving. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. There was no wind, not even a breeze, and yet that swing was swaying back and forth as if someone had just jumped off it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. "Anyone there?" No answer. Just the continued creaking of the swing. I took a few steps closer, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had run through, bumping the swing, or maybe it was just loose, moving on its own. But as I watched, the swing's motion began to change. It wasn't just swaying anymore. It was pumping, going higher and higher, as if an invisible child was putting all their effort into reaching the sky. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. That's when I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. A high, childish giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, searching for the source, but the rest area was still deserted. No children. No one at all. The laughter came again, louder this time. It was joined by other voices, children calling to each other, the sound of running feet on gravel. But there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, the gravel undisturbed. I backed away from the playground, my heart racing. This couldn't be happening. I was tired, that's all. My mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw them. They flickered into view like an old film projection, transparent and wavering. Children, a whole group of them, playing on the equipment. A little girl pumping her legs on the swing that had been moving. Two boys chasing each other around the slide. A smaller child bouncing on the spring horse. They were dressed oddly, I realized, with growing horror. Old-fashioned clothes, girls in pinafores and boys in short pants and caps, like something out of a photograph from the 1930s or 40s. I watched, paralyzed as they played. They seemed so real, so solid, despite being able to see right through them. Their laughter echoed around the empty rest area, a joyful sound that nonetheless filled me with dread. One of the children, a boy of about 10, suddenly stopped and looked right at me. His eyes were dark pools in his pale face, and his expression was one of infinite sadness. "Help us," he said, his voice sounding distant and echoing. "We've been waiting so long." I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to get away. This couldn't be real. Ghosts weren't real. I was hallucinating, had to be. But as I retreated, the spectral children began to fade. Their laughter became fainter, their forms more transparent until they disappeared altogether. The playground was once again empty and still. I ran back to my truck, my legs feeling like lead. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. There at the edge of the playground stood the boy who had spoken to me. He was more solid now, more real, and he was crying, silent tears streaming down his face as he watched me. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the rest area, gravel spraying behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I drove through the night, pushing the speed limit, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that haunted playground as possible. As the miles rolled by and the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. It had to have been a hallucination brought on by fatigue, or maybe someone had slipped something into my coffee at the last truck stop. Anything was more believable than actual ghosts, but deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen was real. Those children trapped in some kind of limbo, endlessly reliving their last moments of play. The thought made my heart ache. How long had they been there? What had happened to them? I couldn't shake the image of that boy's face, the sadness in his eyes as he asked for help. Help to do what? Move on? Find peace? I didn't know, and the not knowing gnawed at me. When I finally reached Denver and delivered my load, I went straight to the nearest library with internet access. I spent hours searching for any information about the Pinewood Rest area, looking for reports of accidents or missing children. What I found chilled me to the bone. In 1947, a school bus full of children had broken down at that very rest stop. While waiting for help, the children had played on the newly installed playground equipment. But when a freak storm blew in, bringing with it a massive lightning strike, tragedy struck. The entire playground had been electrified. 12 children lost their lives that day. The playground had been rebuilt, the incident hushed up in the way small towns often do with tragedies. But the land remembered, and so did the children. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. Those children I'd seen, they were the victims of that long-ago tragedy, stuck in a loop, forever playing on that playground, unaware that their lives had ended decades ago. The boy's plea for help echoed in my mind. We've been waiting so long. Waiting for what? For someone to see them? To remember them? To help them move on? I didn't have answers, but I knew I couldn't just ignore what had happened. Those children needed help, and for whatever reason, they had chosen to reveal themselves to me. As I left the library, I made a decision. My next run would take me back east, and I'd make a point of stopping at the Pinewood Rest area again. I didn't know what I could do for those ghostly children, but I had to try something. Maybe just acknowledging them, remembering their story, would be enough to help them find peace. The thought of returning to that haunted playground filled me with dread. But it also gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since that night, I felt the tiniest glimmer of hope. As I climbed back into my truck, I glanced at myself in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the face of that ghostly boy reflected back at me, a small smile on his lips. Then it was gone, leaving just my own tired face staring back. I started the engine, my mind already planning my return trip. Those children had been waiting for over 70 years. They could wait a little longer. But this time when I came back, I'd be ready. Ready to face whatever waited for me on that haunted playground. Ready to help those lost souls find their way home. As I pulled out onto the highway, the sun setting behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life as a simple truck driver was over. A new journey was beginning, one that would take me places I never imagined existed. And it all started with a creaking swing and a child's laughter on the night wind. The digital readout flickered to life, 80,000 pounds. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Now it read 666. My blood ran cold as I realized this wasn't just any way station. I was about to embark on the most terrifying journey of my life, trapped in a loop with a ghostly operator who seemed determined to weigh more than just my truck. Name's Eddie, been hauling freight across the country for nigh on 2 decades now. Thought I'd seen it all, from midnight breakdowns in the middle of nowhere to lot lizards that could make a sailor blush. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what went down at that godforsaken way station just outside of Barstow, California. It was a run like any other, hauling a load of electronics from LA to Chicago. I'd done this route more times than I could count, knew every pothole and truck stop along the way. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving nothing but an endless sea of stars above and the occasional flash of headlights from oncoming traffic. I was making good time, the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the low rumble of my rig's engine lulling me into that zen-like state long-haul drivers know all too well. That's when I saw the sign, "Way station ahead. All trucks must exit." Now, I'll be honest, I've been known to bypass a way station or two in my day, but something about this one made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the sign seemed to glow a little too brightly in my headlights, or how the exit ramp appeared out of nowhere, like it had just materialized out of the desert night. I eased off the throttle and took the exit, gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled onto the way station lot. The place looked deserted. No other trucks, no DOT officers in sight. Just a small, dimly lit booth and the hulking shape of the scale itself, barely visible in the gloom. As I maneuvered my rig onto the scale, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, charged with a kind of static electricity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And it was quiet. Too quiet. No distant highway noise, no hum of electricity from the booth. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. I pulled to a stop, the sudden absence of engine noise almost deafening. That's when I noticed the booth wasn't as empty as I'd first thought. There was a figure inside, barely visible through the grimy window. I squinted, trying to make out details, but all I could see was a vague, shadowy outline. Suddenly, the digital readout on the scale flickered to life. 80,000 pounds? I frowned. That couldn't be right. My load was nowhere near that heavy. Must be a malfunction. I blinked and the numbers changed. 666. My heart skipped a beat. This definitely wasn't right. The numbers began to shift rapidly, cycling through a dizzying array of figures. 1947, 23, 13,666. Each new number sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. They seemed to mean something important, but the meaning danced just out of reach. That's when I heard it. A voice crackling through the ancient speaker mounted on the booth. "Step out of the vehicle, please." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to put the truck in gear and get the hell out of there. But years of conditioning, of following the rules of the road, won out. With trembling hands, I opened the door and climbed down from the cab. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way to the booth. As I got closer, I could make out more details of the figure inside. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man. But there was something wrong about him. His movements were jerky, mechanical, like one of those old-time animatronics at a rundown amusement park. "Papers," the figure said as I approached the window. Its voice was flat, devoid of any emotion or inflection. I fumbled in my pocket for my logbook and registration, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the papers. As I held them out, the figure turned to face me fully for the first time. I recoiled in horror. Its face was wrong, blurry like a photograph that had been copied too many times. Features shifted and flowed, never quite settling into a recognizable pattern. But its eyes, God, its eyes were sharp and clear, boring into me with an intensity that made my soul shrivel. "You're overweight," it said, those terrible eyes never blinking. "You'll have to offload." But that's impossible," I stammered. "The scale must be broken. My load's well under the limit." The figure's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "The scale is never wrong. You're carrying too much. Offload." Before I could protest further, the figure began to move. It passed through the booth wall like it wasn't even there, its form flickering like a bad TV signal. As it approached me, I could feel the temperature drop, my breath coming out in visible puffs despite the warm desert night. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. The figure kept coming, its movements becoming more erratic, more inhuman with each step. And as it drew closer, I began to hear whispers, countless voices, all speaking at once, a cacophony of pleas and warnings and laments. "Help us," they seemed to say. "You're next." The wait, the terrible wait. I turned and ran, sprinting back to my truck with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I could feel the figure right behind me, its cold presence raising goosebumps on my skin. I wrenched open the door and threw myself into the cab, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear. As I pulled away from the scale, I risked a glance in my side mirror. The figure stood there, watching me go, and behind it, translucent shapes began to materialize. Other drivers, dozens of them, all trapped at this ghostly way station. I hit the highway, doing well over the speed limit, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Miles flew by as I pushed my rig to its limits, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that hellish place as possible. It wasn't until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky that I finally eased off the gas. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and I was drenched in cold sweat. But I was alive. I'd escaped, or had I? Or had. As the adrenaline began to wear off, doubts started to creep in. Had it all been some kind of hallucination? A waking nightmare brought on by too many hours on the road and too much gas station coffee? It seemed impossible, the stuff of campfire stories and late-night horror movies. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I'd seen, what I'd experienced, was real. That way station existed somewhere between our world and something else. A place where the lost souls of truckers were trapped, forever trying to offload an impossible weight. I pulled into the first truck stop I came across, my legs shaky as I climbed down from the cab. As I made my way to the diner, desperate for some coffee and human contact, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. For a moment, just the briefest instant, I saw that blurry, shifting face superimposed over my own. Those piercing eyes staring back at me, filled with a hunger that chilled me to my core. I blinked and it was gone. Just my own haggard face looking back at me. But I knew then that I'd brought something back with me from that way station. Some kind of mark, invisible but undeniable. As I settled into a booth, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that my journey was far from over. That ghostly operator and his impossible scale were out there waiting. And sooner or later, I'd have to face them again. But next time, I'd be ready. I'd find a way to help those trapped souls, to break whatever curse held them there. Because if I didn't, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that I'd end up joining them. Another lost trucker, forever trying to offload the weight of his own sins. The waitress came by to refill my coffee, giving me an odd look. "You all right, hon? Look like you've seen a ghost." I managed a weak smile. "Just a long night on the road," I said. But as I gazed out at the parking lot, watching other trucks come and go, I couldn't help but wonder. How many of them had encountered that ghostly way station? How many carried the same invisible mark I did? One thing was certain. My days of being just another trucker were over. A new road stretched out before me, one filled with shadows and whispers and things that defied explanation. And like it or not, I was along for the ride.